I used to go trick-or-treating with my friend Peter when I was little on Halloween. After viewing horror movies, we would hang out with whatever dark confectionery we had obtained. Peter and I trick-or-treated in my neighborhood, which was rather large on this particular night. After that, we returned to my place. Peter was supposed to stay the night after we watched a movie. My mother, the only other person home, announced shortly after we arrived that she was going to bed because it was just 9 o'clock. But the following morning she had work. Afterwards, when we were in the lounge room, we watched a terrifying movie. I had likely invested 30 minutes. I heard the knock on the front door. The notion that we were watching a horror movie truly shocked me. Then came to understand that it was Halloween. I eventually stopped being afraid because I believed it to be a trick-or-treater. I then moved in the direction of the door. But as I neared, I realized how late it was, almost 10 o'clock p.m. Additionally, there were not many individuals still awake at this hour. I made a decision to simply glance out the window to see who it was first. I peered out from behind the curtains and noticed a sinister-looking man at the entrance. "You appear to be rather tall, thin, and bearded. You were wearing shades as well, but you didn't look like you were wearing a costume." It gave me the creeps, to be honest. I thus chose not to open the door. Peter, who was on the sofa, then inquired as to my identity. I informed him that a strange-looking man was there and that I was just not responding. I observed the guy as he slowly began to walk away after briefly turning to glance around. I was quite relieved to see him leave because, even as a 13-year-old, I was easily frightened. I returned and continued the film. However, I would estimate that it was only around 15 minutes later when we once again received a tapping at the door. They banged a second time, louder this time, and we disregarded it. Although I knew my mother was sleeping and had to wake up early for work, I still wanted to contact her. Thus, I did not. This time, Peter and I approached the window in silence and peered out. But as we opened the curtains, we could see the person standing on our front step staring at us. I looked at the guy, who had a furious expression on his face. We fled back to the lounge room and hurriedly closed the window again. All we wanted was for the guy to choose to go. Meanwhile, we noticed pounding again, but this time it wasn't at the door. It then moved to the window, where we were gazing outside. The shades prevented us from seeing him, but we were aware that he was on the opposite side. I was beginning to panic. Peter suggested that maybe it was just a man attempting to terrify folks on Halloween. I certainly hope it was. The guy continued to tap on windows, moving from one to the next. He appeared to be moving toward the back of the house by going around it. After then, there was silence for a short time. Peter and I were limited to just sitting and listening. We then abruptly heard the jarring sound of breaking glass. It seemed to be coming from one of the basement windows at the back of the house. Peter and I both ran upstairs to my mother's room at 5 as soon as we heard this. Once we had ascended, we informed her that somebody had just sneaked into the house when we woke her up. My mother grabbed her phone, dialed 911, and shut the door to her bedroom. When we overheard Mom calling the police, Peter and I hid beneath her bed. Then all we had to do was wait for the police to show up. Despite hearing the man downstairs, we never saw him ascend the stairs. We eventually lost track of him. The moment the police arrived, he had left. One of the most unsettling events in my life occurred 3 years back on Halloween, and this is what occurred. My son, who is now 9 years old but was 7 at the time of this tale, is my child. With him and my wife, I went trick-or-treating in our neighborhood, which was full of youngsters, and the evening was rather busy. My son became weary and was content with the number of sweets he had when we were gone for maybe 2 hours. We then made our way back home and entered. We only placed a plate of sweets in front of our house while we were away. By the time we returned, it was empty. Despite the fact that it was only 8 o'clock, my son had just begun to eat some of his sweets when we just returned inside. I anticipated that when the doorbell rang, it would be another trick-or-treater. When I opened the front door, a little boy approximately my son's age and his father were standing there grinning. As the demand for sweets increased, I contacted my wife to see whether we had any more. His son was sort of hopping up and down, as I saw, and the guy apologized profusely before explaining that his son needed to use the restroom, even though they were still about a 30-minute trip from their home. My wife was in view and I was across the room. Additionally, I didn't wish to allow them into the house. However, I assumed I had to, so I let them go. I moved closer to my wife as the youngster dashed down the hallway. She claimed she objected to strangers entering our house without permission. Neither did I, but the father looked to be a decent man. My wife heard me say everything was okay. A moment later, the youngster came back with his dad, who repeatedly thanked them. He received some candy from me, and they continued their journey. I felt relieved when they left the house at that time, and for the rest of the evening, we had another few trick-or-treaters. Afterward, we all eventually went to sleep. All was fine until my son yelled at me in the middle of the night and ran into my bedroom. My spouse and I noticed that he was standing outside of our room and reporting that a stranger had entered his window. A guy who had been in our house recently was exiting the window as I rushed down the hallway into his bedroom. This was an awful sensation, and I was simply relieved that my youngster appeared to be well. I ran after the guy, but he disappeared. I decided to contact the police at that time. Up until they showed up, I was extremely irritated. We told them a whole truth. And for the remainder of the evening, my spouse and I stayed up until late. We slept in our bedroom with our son for the following several nights until we heard that the police had located the person. We were informed that the youngster who entered our home to use the restroom was not the person's son, but rather a boy he had kidnapped a year earlier. The youngster being returned to his family was a shocking piece of news to hear, and I'm simply relieved that the perpetrator got prosecuted. I experienced this during my first year of college. I attended a large university, and over time, I made a respectable number of new acquaintances and formed a few social groups. In my first year, I had made plans to go out for Halloween with a few of my pals. We ventured out to a few of the pubs near college while I was in nerd costume. Some of my companions wanted to go to one of the town's more stern pubs when it grew darker. Being 20, I believed I wouldn't even be admitted at the moment. I advised them to continue. I also asked a handful of my other buddies through Snapchat what they were up to. Robert, one of my pals, informed me about a gathering to which he had been invited. He asked me if I wanted to go with him, and stated that it was going to be huge. This was ideal for me since I was not exhausted and still wished to socialize. I promised him I would follow, so I made my way to the campus boundary to meet him. We then made our way a few streets to the location Robert had given me. We spotted what looked to be the home. I could hardly hear the music booming from within, and we observed a youngster sitting out front drinking a beer while sporting goggles and a sports jersey. Robert welcomed the young child, who I assume knew him, as we approached. The young boy introduced himself and stated his name was Ander. We then both entered the house. The first thing we saw was a little doorway that was crammed with shoes. We removed ours before exiting through a different entryway and into a space where a speaker was playing music loudly, but no one was present. Right away, I had a horrible feeling. Additionally, I heard footsteps behind us as I moved toward the next room. When Robert and I turned back, two big men carrying baseball bats were entering the room. I was unable to identify them because of the black masks covering their faces. They seemed to stand taller than 6 feet. One of the guys said that if we didn't comply with their demands, they would injure us. The adjacent room, which looked to be located at the back of the home, was where we were told to go. Robert and I both appeared to be in great fear and shock. The kitchen looked to be in the following space. The chair and a little bench were there, along with a burner and a basin. Then the home's rear door. The two persons instructed us to proceed to the basement through a heavy door that is likewise ripped open. They had their bats in their hands and were aiming with their hands as they stood approximately 6 feet behind us. Robert pushed me as we moved in the direction of the door, and as I was looking at him, he immediately dashed towards the rear kitchen door, which I watched him unlock in an instant by pulling back the lock. I pursued him and sprinted as rapidly as I could to the door without even stopping to think. As I did, I felt a great rush of excitement. The guys behind us began to shout and hurry after us, and I heard them. Robert was running out the door when I nearly crashed into him, almost falling over him. Since I was about to go, the back of my right leg felt like it had been struck by a baseball bat when I heard the men approaching. It pierced my upper right leg and caused excruciating pain. However, the thrill forced me to leave, and I stick with Robert as he circles the house aside. My leg hurt more the farther we ran, but it seems like the guys who were behind us are moving a little bit further away from us. To slow the men down as we passed 2 trash bins that were on the side of the house, I kicked one of them over. Robert shouted and began to run. We had lost sight of the people following us by the time we arrived at the street. I ran with Robert back to campus until I finally gave up due to exhaustion and leg discomfort. After calling the police, we gave them the house's address and other pertinent information. Nobody was present when they arrived. Additionally, the home was empty at the time. It belonged to a man who frequently rented out apartments to college students. Robert and I probably came close to avoiding a tragic situation that evening. Additionally, my leg hurt a lot for a few weeks. But other than that, I was okay.